Mr. President, in a few moments, I'm going to make a unanimous consent request in regards to Delaware Syed to be the Deputy Administrator of the Small Business Administration. Let me give you a little bit of background about Mr. Syed's nomination and why I'm using this unusual process to advance the nomination to the floor for floor consideration. We all know the tremendous need at the Small Business Administration as a result of COVID-19. We worked together, Democrats and Republicans, and created many new programs to help small businesses. We created the Paycheck Protection Program, both the first, we modified it, and then a second round. We created the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Advance Program and Targeted Grant Program. We provided for the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant Program. We established a Restaurant Revitalization Fund, and the list goes on and on and on. All this created new programs and responsibilities for the Small Business Administration. And we did this together, Democrats and Republicans, in order to advance the needs for small businesses during COVID-19. Over $1 trillion of funds were administered by the Small Business Administration as a result of our initiatives. And our constituents had tremendous needs. It was tens of millions of small businesses have benefited from what we did to help them through COVID-19. And I know that every one of our offices have gotten numerous inquiries from small businesses as to how these programs were stood up, whether they could qualify, concerns about their applications being filed promptly, the lack of funds, the need to replenish funds, and the list goes on and on and on, that put tremendous demand on the Small Business Administration. And we were pretty tough on the Small Business Administration to get these programs up and running because we knew how desperate it was for our small business community. Now, the Deputy Administrator's job is to oversee the day-to-day operations of the agency. That's the position we're talking about for Mr. Syed, the Deputy Administrator of the Small Business Administration. So over 5 months ago, the Small Business Committee, under my leadership as chair, had a hearing of Mr. Syed's appointment. And we discovered during that nomination process that he's extremely well qualified to assume these responsibilities. He has spent decades building and developing and scaling successful small businesses, as well as his advocacy for underserved small businesses. So the hearing, I thought, went extremely well, and that we would have no difficulty advancing his nomination to the floor of the United States Senate. But after his hearing, my Republican colleagues requested information from the small business administration about his loans that he took out as a small business owner. It was a reasonable request. On June 8th, I helped arrange to supply that information to the members of the committee. And they reviewed his small business loan applications, Mr. Syed's small business applications. And there was one thing that was pretty unusual about that, in that even though he was qualified to receive forgivable 7A loans under the Paycheck Protection Program, he decided to repay the loans because he said he didn't need the government to pay on a forgivable loan. He took exemplary action. And after the review, I believe all my colleagues were satisfied that his arrangements with the SBA was exemplary. Next, the Republicans decided to move to a different target. They accused Mr. Syed of being anti-Israel bias, which was completely unfounded. The American Jewish Committee wrote to our committee to say, and I quote, "The unsupported accusations that somehow Jewish businesses or those with ties to Israel may not fare as well under Syed's leadership in the Small Business Administration has no factual grounding. Indeed, he has had specifically disavowed support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which seeks the dissolution of Israel. AJC rejects the charges. They go on to say it's un-American, the charges that have been made, and I agree. My colleagues had the right to ask questions for the record, and they did. Mr. Syed responded to those questions for the record, again repeating the fact that he's been against the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, that he's worked with companies in Israel, and in fact visited Israel in order to promote the relationships. So again, we thought now at last we'll be able to move Mr. Syed's nomination. But now the Republicans found a new reason to block his nomination. Committee Republicans announced that they would withhold a quorum on the vote because Planned Parenthood affiliates receive loans under the Paycheck Protection Program. As one of the negotiators of the CARES Act, and this was Democrats and Republicans again working together, and negotiated this with Senator Rubio, Senator Collins, and Senator Shaheen, let me explain to my colleagues how nonprofits are treated under the Paycheck Protection Program. When the SBA considers whether or not a business qualifies as a small business, it considers affiliation. Generally, affiliations exist when one business controls or has the power to control another, or when a third party controls or has the power to control both businesses. Control may arise through ownership, management, or other relationships or interactions between the parties. The CARES Act requires that nonprofits eligible for PPP loans abide by the same affiliation rules that are applicable to small businesses. The fact is that the Planned Parenthood Federation of America does not exercise control over its member organizations because it does not have common management. Each member organization is its own independent, not-for-profit, tax-exempt organization with its own independent board of directors that is solely responsible for the hiring and retention of its CEO. Planned Parenthood Federation does not have the power to remove CEOs or directors or its individual member organizations. This type of federated structure is common in the nonprofit world and is the reason why nonprofits such as the YMCA, Boys and Girls Clubs, also qualify for PPP loans. The SBA must apply its affiliation rules in a uniform way, and it's wrong to ask the SBA to do otherwise for political or ideological reasons. There is no reason why Planned Parenthood should be singled out for receiving a PPP loans, which I must remind my colleagues were created to help keep Americans in their jobs during the pandemic. That's the reason for it. That's why we included nonprofits. Partisan, unnecessary, and unconscionable inaction of our Republican colleagues show no concern for the millions of small businesses still relying on SBA support to survive COVID-19 and rebuild their future, and would benefit greatly by having a confirmed deputy administrator to work on the day-to-day operations at the SBA. One last point, if I might. The Small Business Committee reported out Mr. Syed's nomination by a bipartisan vote, but due to a technicality, another vote was required, and the Republican members at this time decided to block the quorum. Mr. President, as a matter of fairness, as a matter of the needs of the small business community in our states, as a matter of the integrity of this body to have a process that has some degree of respect for the nominees that go through the nomination process, I'm going to make a UC request that the nomination be put on our calendar like any other reported nominee, subject to the action of this body.